My name is Matthew Anderson, 68 years old, and I never thought my own flesh and blood would betray me like this. I arrived at my deceased ex-wife Margaret's will reading to find my sons blocking my seat. "Dad, you're not even mentioned here. Just leave," said Jason coldly. Thomas nodded in agreement, arms crossed. The attorney looked uncomfortable but said nothing. 40 years of marriage, ended by divorce 2 years ago, and now this final betrayal. But they don't know about the folder I'm carrying. Before I continue with this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever felt betrayed by family. Margaret and I met during our sophomore year at the University of Michigan. She was studying art history, and I was pursuing civil engineering. We literally bumped into each other at the library one rainy October afternoon. Her books scattered across the floor, and as we both knelt to pick them up, our eyes met. Her green eyes had flecks of gold that seemed to dance when she laughed at my nervous apology. That moment changed my life forever. We dated for 3 years before getting married in a small ceremony with just our families and closest friends. Margaret looked breathtaking in her simple white dress, her auburn hair adorned with tiny white flowers. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. We moved into a tiny apartment near my first job at a construction company. Those early days were filled with struggle but also immeasurable joy. We were building a life together, brick by brick. Jason came along in our second year of marriage. I'll never forget the feeling of holding my firstborn son, his tiny fingers gripping my thumb with surprising strength. 4 years later, Thomas joined our family. Margaret was radiant as a mother, patient and loving. She would spend hours reading to the boys, creating elaborate bedtime stories that featured them as the heroes. I worked hard during the day and came home to this beautiful family each night, my heart full of gratitude. As the years passed, I managed to save enough to start my own construction business. Margaret, who had been working part-time as an art teacher, became my business partner. She had an eye for design and a gift for communication that complemented my technical skills perfectly. Together, we built Anderson Construction into a respected company in Michigan. Our specialty became restoration of historic buildings, preserving the beauty of the past while ensuring structural integrity for the future. Our family prospered. We moved into a beautiful colonial house with a large yard where the boys could play. We took summer vacations to the coast, built sandcastles, and collected seashells. We celebrated birthdays, graduations, and achievements with genuine joy. Margaret and I weren't perfect parents by any means, but we loved our sons fiercely and did our best to raise them with strong values and compassion. The first significant change in our family dynamic came when Margaret's sister Paula needed a place to stay after her divorce. Paula had always been the more dramatic of the two sisters, prone to exaggeration and fueled by a constant need for attention. Margaret's kind heart couldn't turn away her sister in need, so Paula moved into our guest room temporarily. That temporary stay stretched into months, then years. At first, Paula was grateful and helpful around the house, but gradually, subtle changes began to occur. I would come home to find Margaret and Paula in deep conversation that would abruptly stop when I entered the room. Paula would make small comments about how hard Margaret worked while I was always at the office. She questioned my business decisions within earshot of Margaret, planting seeds of doubt where there had previously been trust. Around this time, Margaret began experiencing health problems. Her doctor diagnosed her with a heart condition that required medication and lifestyle changes. She became more fatigued, sometimes spending entire days in bed. Paula appointed herself as Margaret's caretaker, often protecting my wife from what she called my demanding presence. The distance between Margaret and me grew wider with each passing day. I tried to talk to Margaret about my concerns regarding Paula's influence, but these conversations invariably ended in arguments. Margaret accused me of being jealous of her relationship with her sister. "She's the only one who truly understands me," Margaret would say, words that cut deep into my heart. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home. The divorce blindsided me. I came home from a construction site one evening to find divorce papers on the kitchen table. Margaret sat there, her expression unreadable, Paula standing behind her like a sentinel. "I can't do this anymore, Matthew," Margaret said. "We've grown apart, and I need to find myself again. I begged for marriage counseling, for a chance to fix whatever had broken between us. But Margaret was resolute. The divorce proceeded quickly, with Margaret receiving the family home and a substantial portion of our shared assets. I moved into a small apartment, shell-shocked and grieving the loss of the life we had built together. Despite numerous attempts to communicate with Margaret afterward, she refused to see or speak with me. My texts went unanswered. My calls sent straight to voicemail. The woman I had loved for 4 decades had completely shut me out of her life. Yet, I continued to love and respect her. The memories of our good years together remained precious to me, and I held on to hope that someday, somehow, we might at least find friendship again. When I received the call about Margaret's sudden death from a heart attack, the grief hit me with unexpected force. Despite our estrangement, she had been my partner for most of my life, the mother of my children, my first and deepest love. I wept alone in my apartment, mourning not just her death but also the reconciliation that would never come. I decided to attend the will reading not because I expected to receive anything but because I needed closure. 40 years of marriage deserved a proper goodbye, even if it came in the formal setting of an attorney's office. I never imagined that this final chapter would unfold the way it did, with my own sons standing as barriers between me and the woman who had once been the center of my world. Jason and Thomas were the pride of my life. From the moment they were born, I poured my heart and soul into being their father. Jason was always the serious one, methodical and determined from an early age. He would spend hours building elaborate structures with his blocks, carefully planning each addition. Thomas was more carefree, quick to laugh and eager to explore. They were different in temperament but equally precious to me. I coached their little league teams, helped with science projects, taught them to fish at the lake near our summer cabin. When Jason expressed interest in construction, I brought him to job sites, explaining the processes and introducing him to the craft I loved. When Thomas showed an aptitude for science, Margaret and I encouraged his curiosity, buying him microscopes and chemistry sets. We attended every school play, every baseball game, every academic award ceremony. As they grew into young men, I felt immense pride watching them forge their own paths. Jason followed in my footsteps, studying business and construction management. After graduation, he joined Anderson Construction, working his way up from project manager to vice president. Thomas pursued medicine, eventually becoming a cardiologist at Michigan General Hospital. Both successful, both seemingly happy, both still connected to their mother and me. The changes began subtly after Jason had been with the company for about 5 years. He became increasingly focused on profits over quality, suggesting shortcuts that went against the company's reputation for excellence. When I expressed concerns, he would dismiss them as old-fashioned thinking. Board meetings became battlegrounds, with Jason challenging my decisions in front of other executives. "The company needs to evolve, Dad," he would say, his tone condescending. "We can't rely on your outdated methods forever." Thomas, who had previously stayed neutral in business matters, began to side with his brother. During family dinners, the conversation would often turn to the company, with both sons suggesting I should consider retirement. "You've worked hard enough, Dad," Thomas would say, his voice gentle but his message clear. "It's time to relax and let the next generation take over." After the divorce, the distance between us widened dramatically. Phone calls became infrequent, then rare. Invitations to family gatherings stopped coming. When I would run into other relatives who mentioned barbecues or birthday celebrations at Margaret's house, I realized I was being deliberately excluded from events where my sons were present. I made countless attempts to understand what had changed. I invited them to lunch, sent thoughtful gifts on birthdays and holidays, even wrote heartfelt letters expressing my love and desire to maintain our relationship. Jason's responses were curt and businesslike, while Thomas occasionally sent polite but distant text messages. Neither would agree to meet me in person without Margaret present, which she consistently refused. The truth about their changed perception came to me through Franklin Roberts, my oldest friend and the company's financial advisor. "I don't know how to tell you this, Matt," he said during one of our monthly dinners, "but the boys have been spreading some pretty nasty rumors about you around town." According to Franklin, my sons were telling business associates and family friends that I had mistreated Margaret throughout our marriage, that I had driven her to illness through neglect, that the divorce was the result of my infidelity. None of it was true, but the stories had spread through our social circle like wildfire, tarnishing the reputation I had spent decades building. Margaret finally told us everything. "Dad," Jason said during our last conversation, when I confronted him about these rumors, about the affairs, about how you prioritized work over her health, about the verbal abuse. She protected you for years, but she couldn't keep your secrets anymore. I was stunned into silence. Affairs, abuse, these were fabrications, stories that bore no resemblance to the life Margaret and I had shared. But my protestations fell on deaf ears. My sons had chosen to believe a version of me that I couldn't recognize, a villain in a story I hadn't written. Despite the heartbreak of being maligned by my own children, I decided to attend the will reading. Perhaps, I thought, this final connection to Margaret would provide some answers. Perhaps, facing my sons in the presence of legal professionals would allow truth to emerge. Franklin warned me against going, predicting further humiliation, but I felt compelled to be there, to honor the woman I had loved, despite everything that had happened. The night before the will reading, I sat in my apartment looking through old photo albums, pictures of vacations, school events, and quiet moments at home, images of a happy family that now existed only in memory and fading photographs. I traced Margaret's face with my finger, wondering how we had arrived at this point. What had Paula whispered in her ear all those years? What had my sons been told that turned them against me so completely? With these questions circling in my mind, I finally fell into a troubled sleep, preparing myself for whatever would come the next day. The morning of Margaret's will reading dawned gray and drizzly, fitting weather for the task ahead. I woke early, unable to sleep past 5 despite my exhaustion. My hands trembled slightly as I knotted my tie, the same navy blue one I had worn to our sons' graduations. Margaret had given it to me as an anniversary gift many years ago, and wearing it felt like carrying a small piece of our better days with me. I spent extra time on my appearance that morning, trimming my silver beard precisely, smoothing the collar of my best shirt, not out of vanity, but respect. Whatever Margaret had thought of me in her final years, I would present myself with dignity. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the weathered face staring back at me. Grief and stress had carved new lines around my eyes and mouth, and I looked every one of my 68 years. Franklin called as I was preparing to leave. "I'll meet you at the coffee shop across from the law office at 9, he said. "We can go over together." His loyalty through this ordeal had been unwavering, one of the few bright spots in the darkness that had enveloped my life. When we met, Franklin handed me a sealed manila folder. "Just in case," he said cryptically. "I've been doing some research that you might need today. Only open it if absolutely necessary." When I tried to ask questions, he shook his head. "Trust me on this, Matt. Let's hope you never need to open it." The law office of Wilson and Associates occupied the top floor of a downtown building. As we rode the elevator, Franklin squeezed my shoulder. "Remember who you are," he said, "no matter what happens in there." The reception area was already filled with family members when we arrived. Paula sat in a corner, surrounded by her adult children. She looked up as I entered, her lips curling into a brief, satisfied smile before she leaned toward Jason, whispering something that made him glance my way with narrowed eyes. Thomas stood by the window, speaking quietly with his wife Sarah. When he saw me, he straightened, whispered something to Sarah, and they both turned away. The rejection stung, but I had prepared myself for it. There were other relatives present I hadn't expected to see. Margaret's elderly Aunt Eleanor sat alone, her cane propped against her chair. Cousins I hadn't seen in years nodded awkwardly in my direction. My former brother-in-law David, who had always been friendly with me, looked away when our eyes met. The atmosphere was thick with tension and unspoken accusations. Harold Wilson, Margaret's attorney for the past decade, emerged from his office to greet the assembled family. He was a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually serious expression. He shook hands with everyone, his grip firm but his eyes avoiding direct contact when he reached me. "We'll begin shortly in the conference room," he announced. "Please help yourselves to refreshments while we prepare the final documents." As people moved toward the refreshment table, I overheard Paula speaking to my sons. "Make sure he doesn't cause trouble," she said, not bothering to lower her voice. "Your mother was very specific about her wishes, and he has no right to interfere now." Jason nodded solemnly. "Don't worry. He won't disrupt anything. We'll make sure of it." Franklin and I accepted cups of coffee and stood apart from the others. "There's something strange about this whole setup," Franklin murmured. "Harold seems unusually tense, even for a will reading." Before I could respond, Harold's assistant announced that they were ready to begin. The family filed into the large conference room with its polished mahogany table and leather chairs. I moved toward an empty seat near the middle of the table, but as I approached, both Jason and Thomas stepped in front of me, blocking my path. "Dad, you're not even mentioned here," Jason said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Just leave. This is for family who actually meant something to Mom." The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward us, the uncomfortable spectacle of a father being publicly rejected by his sons. In that moment, I felt a pain so acute it was almost physical, a knife twisting in my chest. These were my boys, the children I had raised, taught to ride bikes, comforted after nightmares. And now they stood before me as strangers, their faces hard with contempt. "Jason, Thomas, please," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "I was married to your mother for 40 years. I just want to pay my respects and get some closure." Jason crossed his arms, his 6-foot frame blocking the chair completely. "Closure? You lost that right when you broke Mom's heart. The divorce gave you all the closure you deserve." Thomas, standing shoulder to shoulder with his brother, added, "Mom specifically restructured her will after the divorce. You're not mentioned, not welcome, and not wanted here." His medical training had taught him precision, and he knew exactly where to aim his words for maximum pain. From her seat at the table, Paula spoke up. "You heard them, Mathew. This is a family matter now, and you're no longer family. You made your choice years ago." The other relatives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some looked down at the table, unwilling to witness my humiliation. Others watched with undisguised curiosity, eager to see how the drama would unfold. Harold Wilson cleared his throat, making a weak attempt to regain control of the situation. "Perhaps we should all take our seats and begin the proceedings," he suggested, not quite meeting my eyes. "Not until he leaves," Jason insisted. Mom was clear about who should be here. The rejection was absolute, public, and devastating. I felt blood rush to my face, my ears ringing with shame. In that moment, I was not a successful businessman, not a father, not a person with 6 decades of life experience. I was simply an unwanted intruder, being escorted from the last chapter of a story I had helped write. "You know what Mom told us right after the divorce," Jason continued, his voice rising. "She said her only regret was not leaving you 20 years earlier. She rewrote her will that same week, making sure you'd get nothing." Thomas nodded. "She finally admitted how miserable you made her. All those years pretending everything was fine, when you were actually controlling and manipulative. You don't deserve anything from her estate." Each word hit like a physical blow. The Margaret they described was unrecognizable to me, as was the monster they painted me to be. I looked around the room, searching for any sympathetic face, any ally who might speak up for the truth of our marriage as I had lived it. But there was only Franklin, standing by the door, his expression grim. Paula watched with evident satisfaction, her arm around her daughter Ashley's shoulders. The woman had achieved what she'd wanted for years, total separation between me and the family I had helped build. She had won Margaret's trust, my son's loyalty, and now, it seemed, whatever material possessions Margaret had left behind. For a brief moment, I considered simply leaving, walking away from this final insult and trying to preserve what little dignity I had left. It would have been easier, certainly, to retreat to my apartment, nurse my wounds in private, and accept that my family was irretrievably lost to me. But then I thought of Margaret. Not the Margaret of these past few years, influenced by Paula and illness, but the Margaret I had loved for 4 decades. The woman who had danced with me in our kitchen at midnight, who had gripped my hand so tightly during the births of our sons. who had built a business and a life with me through good times and bad. I owed it to her memory, to our shared history, to stay. "I'll sit in the back," I said quietly, moving toward a chair against the wall. "I won't interrupt the proceedings." Jason looked ready to object, but Harold intervened. "That seems reasonable. Let's begin, please." As I took my seat in the corner of the room, I felt the weight of decades pressing down on my shoulders. The physical sensation of betrayal and rejection was like nothing I had experienced before. A hollowness opened in my chest, an emptiness where certainty and connection had once resided. My sons, my own flesh and blood, had publicly denounced me based on stories I didn't recognize. The pain was almost unbearable. Yet underneath the pain, something else stirred. Questions I had been too hurt to ask began to form. Why had Margaret changed so dramatically in those final years? What had truly driven her to end our marriage so abruptly? And why did my sons believe so completely in a version of history that contradicted everything I knew to be true? As Harold began to read the formal opening of the will, I clutched the folder Franklin had given me, wondering what answers it might contain. Harold Wilson adjusted his glasses and began reading the legal preamble to Margaret's will. His voice droned on with phrases about being of sound mind, and hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, the standard language that begins such documents. I sat quietly in my corner chair, aware of the occasional glances thrown my way, some curious, some hostile. As Harold moved into the substance of the will, I was surprised to hear the extent of Margaret's estate. She had apparently accumulated substantial assets that I knew nothing about. Properties in Florida and Arizona that we had never discussed purchasing. Investment accounts with balances far exceeding what our joint finances during marriage would have allowed. A collection of valuable artwork acquired in the past 2 years. To my sister Paula Gibson, I leave my vacation home in Sarasota, Florida, along with the sum of $500,000, in gratitude for her unwavering support during my time of need, Harold read. Paula dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, the picture of the devoted sister receiving her just reward. But something didn't add up. Margaret and I had discussed buying a retirement property in Florida for years, but had always decided against it. When had she purchased this home, and with what funds? As Harold continued, it became clear that I had indeed been completely excluded from the will. Margaret had left substantial sums to Jason and Thomas, along with the family home, her jewelry collection, and her ownership stake in Anderson Construction, which we had built together over decades. To my son, Jason Anderson, I leave my 51% ownership of Anderson Construction, with the understanding that he will continue the company legacy according to his best judgment. Jason nodded solemnly, though I caught the flash of triumph in his eyes. With 51% ownership, he would have complete control of the company, able to outvote me on any decision, essentially pushing me out of the business I had founded. Throughout the reading, Paula's confidence seemed to grow. She sat straighter in her chair, occasionally making eye contact with me, her expression one of victory. Jason and Thomas frequently nodded toward her, as if acknowledging some shared understanding. As I listened to the distribution of assets, memories began to surface. About 2 years before our divorce, I had discovered unusual bank statements in Margaret's desk drawer. Transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, withdrawals of large sums without clear purposes. When I had questioned Margaret about them, she had become defensive, accusing me of snooping and controlling her finances. Paula had appeared then, suggesting I was trying to restrict Margaret's independence. The matter had been dropped, but the questions had remained. There had been other strange financial occurrences during those final years of our marriage. Business trips that Margaret took with Paula, returning with expensive new clothing or jewelry. Explanations about investment opportunities that seemed vague when I asked for details. Margaret had always been financially savvy, but these behaviors were out of character for the woman who had carefully budgeted our household for decades. As I pondered these inconsistencies, I noticed Harold's expression as he read certain sections of the will. He seemed uncomfortable, almost pained, particularly when reading portions that included explicit statements about my exclusion due to his treatment of me during our marriage. These didn't sound like Margaret's words at all. but rather Paula's narrative inserted into legal documents. My attention was drawn to an elderly woman sitting near the front of the room. Margaret's Aunt Eleanor, now in her 80s, was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Unlike the others, she didn't look away when our eyes met. Instead, she held my gaze steadily, her wrinkled face thoughtful. After reading through the major bequests, Harold announced a 15-minute break before they would address some administrative matters related to the estate. As people stood and stretched, Eleanor rose slowly, leaning heavily on her cane. To my surprise, she made her way directly to where I sat. "Mathew," she said softly, lowering herself into the chair beside me. "I've been wanting to speak with you." Paula noticed this interaction immediately and started to approach, but Eleanor waved her away with surprising authority. "I'm just offering condolences to an old family friend, Paula. Give us a moment." Once Paula had reluctantly backed away, Eleanor leaned closer. "Margaret wasn't herself these last years, Mathew. I tried to visit whenever I could, but Paula always seemed to be there, controlling who could see her and for how long." My heart began to race. "What are you saying, Eleanor?" "I'm saying you should look very carefully at whatever is in that folder you're holding," she whispered. "Margaret told me things when Paula wasn't around, things that didn't match what everyone else was hearing. I didn't understand it then, but I'm beginning to now." Before she could say more, Paula returned, this time with Jason. "Aunt Eleanor, you should rest. Let me help you back to your seat." The words were caring, but the tone left no room for argument. Eleanor patted my hand before allowing herself to be led away. "Trust your instincts, Mathew. You knew her better than anyone." As the room refilled and Harold prepared to continue, I finally opened the folder Franklin had given me. Inside were documents carefully organized with labeled tabs. The first section contained medical records from Margaret's doctor, showing a progression of her heart condition, but also noting increasing cognitive symptoms and possible early signs of vascular dementia in the year before our divorce. The doctor had recommended neurological testing that, according to the notes, had never been completed. The second section held bank statements showing systematic transfers from Margaret's accounts to Paula's over a 3-year period. The transfers had begun small, but increased significantly after Paula moved in with us. There were also credit card statements, showing Paula had been using Margaret's cards for luxury purchases, expensive trips, and cash advances. The third section contained something that made my hands tremble. A handwritten note from Margaret dated just a month before her death. "I'm confused about so many things now," she had written. "The medication makes it hard to think clearly, but I keep having dreams about Mathew, about our life together. Paula says he hurt me, but that doesn't feel right. Nothing feels right anymore." The note was signed with Margaret's distinctive signature, its uneven lettering suggesting physical difficulty in writing. The fourth section included a legal analysis from another attorney, suggesting that Margaret may not have been legally competent when she changed her will. It cited the medical records and included statements from her former nurse about Paula's controlling behavior and Margaret's increasing confusion. The final section contained photographs apparently taken by Franklin's private investigator, showing Paula using Margaret's credit cards for shopping sprees, driving Margaret's car when Margaret wasn't present, and meeting with unknown individuals while carrying folders of documents with Margaret's name visible on them. As I processed this information, the pieces began to fall into place. The strange financial discrepancies, Margaret's personality change, Paula's increasing control over my wife's life and decisions, the sudden divorce that had seemed to come out of nowhere, the sons who believed a false narrative about their father. Margaret hadn't betrayed me at all. She had been manipulated, possibly during a time of cognitive decline, by someone who saw an opportunity to gain control of her assets. And my sons had been fed lies that turned them against me, making them unwitting accomplices in Paula's scheme. With a clarity I hadn't felt in years, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I gathered the documents, stood up, and walked directly to Harold Wilson. "Mr. Wilson," I said quietly but firmly, "I need to speak with you privately before the proceedings continue." Harold looked startled by my directness. He glanced at Paula, who was watching us with narrowed eyes, then back at me. "I'm in the middle of a will reading, Mr. Anderson. Perhaps afterward. This concerns the validity of the will you're reading, I replied, keeping my voice low. I believe you'll want to see this information immediately. Something in my tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. Harold hesitated, then nodded. We'll take a short recess, he announced to the room. Please remain seated. This will only take a few minutes. Paula stood immediately. What's going on, Harold? We should continue. It's a standard procedure, Paula, Harold responded, his professional demeanor returning. Please be patient. He led me to his private office and closed the door. What is this about, Mathew? If you're contesting the will, there are proper legal channels. I placed the folder on his desk. Before you say anything else, please review these documents. I think you'll understand my concerns. For the next 20 minutes, Harold reviewed the contents of the folder, his expression growing increasingly grave. He studied the medical records first, then the financial documents, then the handwritten note, his frown deepening with each page he turned. Where did you get these? He finally asked. My friend Franklin has been investigating some inconsistencies for several months, I explained. He was concerned about Margaret's sudden change in behavior and the unusual financial activities associated with her accounts. Harold removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. I had some concerns myself, he admitted. The changes to her will were so dramatic, and Margaret seemed different during our meetings. But she insisted she was acting of her own free will, and Paula was always present, confirming everything Margaret said. Without evidence like this, I had no grounds to question her competence. What does this mean for today's proceedings? I asked. Legally, I cannot continue with the will reading when presented with credible evidence that the testator may not have been competent when the will was created, Harold explained. I'll have to suspend the reading pending investigation. These documents suggest possible undue influence and financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. These are serious matters, Mathew. My sons believe I mistreated their mother, I said quietly. They need to know the truth. Harold nodded. I understand. Let me handle this professionally. Please follow my lead. We returned to the conference room, where tension had built during our absence. Paula was standing by Jason's chair, whispering urgently. Thomas was checking his watch repeatedly. The other relatives looked confused and uncomfortable. Ladies and gentlemen, Harold began formally. I regret to inform you that I must suspend today's reading of Margaret Anderson's will. The room erupted in confusion. Paula's voice rose above the others. You can't do that. Everything is in order. We've all taken time to be here. Harold raised his hand for silence. As Margaret's attorney, I am legally obligated to suspend proceedings when presented with evidence that calls into question the validity of the will. Information has come to light suggesting that Margaret may not have been legally competent when she executed this version of her will. What information? What evidence? Jason demanded, standing up. This is just Dad trying to get his hands on Mom's money. Harold maintained his professional composure. The evidence includes medical records indicating cognitive impairment, financial records showing potentially unauthorized transactions, and documentation of possible undue influence. I cannot go into further detail at this time, but as Margaret's attorney, I am bound by ethical and legal obligations to ensure her true wishes are honored. Paula's face had drained of color. This is ridiculous. Margaret was perfectly fine. She knew exactly what she was doing when she cut him out of her will. Eleanor spoke up from her seat. Was she, Paula? Because when I visited last Christmas, she couldn't remember what year it was, and you wouldn't let me speak with her alone. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Eleanor. The elderly woman straightened in her chair, drawing on some inner reserve of strength. Margaret called me twice in the middle of the night last year, confused about where she was. When I tried to discuss it with you, Paula, you said she was just having bad dreams and changed her medication. But no one ever told me what that medication was. Jason looked between Eleanor and Paula, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Aunt Eleanor, what are you saying? I'm saying your mother wasn't well, Jason. Not just her heart, but her mind. And I'm saying some people might have taken advantage of that condition. Eleanor's gaze moved deliberately to Paula, who had begun to gather her purse and papers. This is all lies, Paula declared, her voice shrill. Margaret told me everything about how Mathew treated her. I was protecting her, Harold intervened. Miss Gibson, I strongly advise you not to make any further statements without legal representation. There are serious allegations of financial exploitation that will need to be investigated. Paula turned to Jason and Thomas. Don't listen to any of this. Your father is manipulating everyone, just like he manipulated your mother for years. Jason stood rigid, his face a mask of confusion and anger. Dad, if you're behind this, Jason, I said, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I loved your mother for 40 years. I would never hurt her. I don't know what Paula has told you, but I'm asking you to look at the evidence with an open mind. That's all. Thomas, always the more thoughtful of my sons, had remained silent. Now he spoke, his medical training perhaps allowing him to process the implications more quickly. Mom's behavior did change dramatically those last few years. Her memory issues. I attributed them to stress from the divorce. But if there was an underlying condition, Paula moved toward the door. I don't have to listen to these accusations. Harold, you'll be hearing from my attorney. Harold nodded calmly. I expect I will. In the meantime, I should inform everyone that I will be notifying the proper authorities about potential financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. No one should leave town without providing contact information to my assistant. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. Paula's hasty exit left a vacuum filled with questions and dawning realizations. The relatives who had been so quick to judge me now looked uncertain, exchanging whispers and concerned glances. Jason approached me, his expression still hard, but now tinged with doubt. I want to see those documents, he demanded. Of course, I agreed. Harold has copies of everything. Jason, Thomas, I never stopped loving your mother, and I never stopped loving you both. Whatever you were told about me, please consider that it might not have been the truth. Thomas had moved to speak with Harold, asking detailed questions about the medical records. His medical background would help him understand the implications of Margaret's cognitive symptoms. I could see the professional part of his brain engaging, analyzing the information objectively despite the emotional context. As the reality of the situation began to sink in, the formal will reading dissolved into small groups of people discussing the shocking turn of events. Eleanor made her way back to me, this time without interference. I should have spoken up sooner, she said, regret heavy in her voice. I knew something wasn't right, but Paula always had an explanation, and Margaret seemed to trust her so completely. You're speaking up now, I said, taking her frail hand in mine. That's what matters. Franklin joined us, having observed the dramatic unveiling of his investigative work. I started looking into things after you mentioned those unusual bank statements, he explained. The more I dug, the more concerned I became. I'm just sorry I didn't complete the investigation before Margaret passed away. Jason approached, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. If what these documents suggest is true, he said stiffly, then we've been. He couldn't finish the sentence. We all believed what we were told by someone Margaret trusted, I said gently. Paula was very convincing, but the things Mom said about you. Thomas joined in, standing beside his brother. She told us in detail about arguments, about how you controlled the finances, about affairs. None of that happened, Thomas, I said firmly. Your mother and I had normal disagreements like any couple, but I never controlled her, never cheated, never did any of the things you were told. Think about the father you knew for your entire lives before Paula moved in. Did that man seem capable of what you were told? I could see the doubt working its way through their minds, challenging the narrative they had accepted. Jason's eyes dropped first, unable to maintain his certainty in the face of the evidence and his own memories of our family before everything changed. We need time to process this, he finally said. To review everything carefully. I understand, I replied. I've had 2 years to live with the pain of losing my family. I can give you the time you need to discover the truth. As people began to leave the conference room, the atmosphere had transformed completely from when we entered. The certainty had been replaced by questions, the judgment by doubt. Harold assured everyone he would be in touch about next steps regarding Margaret's estate once the investigation was complete. Standing in that room where I had been humiliated just hours before, I felt no triumph, only sadness for what had been lost. Margaret had spent her final years influenced by someone who didn't have her best interests at heart. My sons had turned against me based on fabrications, and while the truth was finally emerging, it came too late for the reconciliation with Margaret I had longed for. As I gathered my things to leave, Thomas approached me once more. "Dad," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. "Would you be willing to meet for coffee sometime this week? I have questions." It was a small opening, a tiny crack in the wall that had been built between us. But it was something, a beginning. "Anytime, son," I replied. "Anytime at all." In the months following that dramatic will reading, our family entered a period of painful but necessary reckoning with the truth. Harold Wilson launched a formal investigation into the validity of Margaret's final will, working with medical experts to evaluate her cognitive state during its creation. The findings were definitive. Margaret had been experiencing significant cognitive impairment when she made the dramatic changes to her estate planning. The investigators discovered Margaret's original will from 3 years earlier, stored in a safe deposit box that Paula had attempted to empty shortly after Margaret's death. This document divided her assets equally between our sons, with specific bequests to other family members, and a provision leaving her share of Anderson Construction to me, in recognition of our partnership in building the company together. The contrast between this thoughtful, balanced document and the vindictive final will was striking. Medical experts confirmed that the progression of Margaret's vascular dementia would have made her particularly vulnerable to manipulation and suggestion, especially from someone she trusted implicitly. Paula faced serious legal consequences for her actions. The financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult carried both civil and criminal penalties. Bank records revealed she had methodically transferred over $1 million from Margaret's accounts to her own over a 3-year period. The investigation uncovered emails where Paula had actually instructed an assistant to impersonate Margaret for certain financial transactions. For my sons, the revelation of Paula's manipulation was devastating. They had to confront not only the betrayal by their aunt, but also their own willingness to believe the worst about their father, without question. This reckoning came in different ways for each of them. Jason initially responded with stubborn denial. "There must be some explanation," he insisted during our first difficult meeting after the will reading. "Mom wouldn't have just made things up." "She didn't make things up, Jason," I explained patiently. "In her condition, she became confused about reality. Paula took advantage of that confusion, suggesting memories that weren't real, reinterpreting past events to cast me in a negative light. The medical records show this is common with the type of cognitive decline your mother experienced. It took weeks of conversations, reviews of the evidence, and finally, testimonies from Margaret's former caregivers about Paula's controlling behavior for Jason to accept the truth. His pride made it difficult for him to admit he had been so thoroughly deceived, that he had treated his father unjustly based on lies. I should have questioned it more, he finally acknowledged during a long emotional conversation at my apartment. The dad I grew up with, and the monster Paula described, they never matched up. But I wanted to protect Mom, and Paula made it seem so urgent, so clear-cut. Thomas, with his medical background, accepted the evidence more readily. He recognized the symptoms of cognitive decline in the documented behaviors and understood how vulnerable his mother would have been to manipulation. "I failed her as a doctor," he confessed during our first coffee meeting. "I saw the memory issues, the personality changes, but I attributed them to stress and aging. I should have insisted on a full neurological workup. You were her son first, not her doctor," I reminded him. Paula deliberately kept all of us at a distance, controlling access to Margaret and information about her condition. You can't blame yourself for that. Rebuilding relationships with my sons was a slow, sometimes painful process. There were awkward silences, emotional outbursts, and moments when old accusations resurfaced, despite the evidence. Trust, once broken, doesn't mend easily or quickly, but we persevered, sharing meals, memories, and eventually, honest conversations about the future. Eleanor became an unexpected ally in this healing process. Though elderly and frail, her mind remained sharp, and she shared stories about Margaret from their childhood, reminding us all of who she truly had been before illness and manipulation changed her. Margaret adored you, Mathew. Eleanor told me during one family dinner at my apartment, the first time both my sons had visited together. Even during those last confused years, when she would have moments of clarity, she would talk about your early days together with such fondness. Whatever Paula made her believe, that love was real. Once the legal matters were settled and Margaret's original will was validated, I made a decision that surprised my sons. I established the Margaret Anderson Foundation for Elder Protection, using a significant portion of my inheritance to fund education, research, and support services for vulnerable older adults and their families. Your mother was taken advantage of during a time when she needed protection, I explained when I announced the foundation at a small family gathering. I couldn't protect her then, but perhaps this foundation can help others recognize the warning signs and prevent similar situations. The foundation became a healing project for our family. Thomas joined the medical advisory board, contributing his expertise to developing screening protocols for cognitive impairment. Jason's business acumen proved valuable in establishing the organizational structure and financial planning. Even Eleanor participated, sharing her perspective as a senior who had witnessed Margaret's decline. My relationship with Jason remained the more challenging of the two. His personality had always tended toward stubbornness, and admitting his complete misjudgment of the situation wounded his pride deeply. There were setbacks, like when he discovered emails he had sent colleagues describing me as mentally abusive toward Margaret. "I can't believe I wrote these things," he said, showing me the emails with evident shame. "I was so convinced I was protecting Mom." "Paula was very persuasive," I reminded him. "And you loved your mother. She took advantage of that love." Gradually, Jason's defensiveness gave way to genuine remorse. 6 months after the will reading, he approached me with a proposal to rename our company's charitable initiative after Margaret, creating an annual scholarship for young women entering construction management. It was his way of honoring both his mother's memory and acknowledging the injustice that had been done. Thomas's path to reconciliation came more easily. His analytical mind processed the evidence methodically, and once convinced of the truth, he committed himself fully to rebuilding our relationship. He began bringing his children to visit me regularly, ensuring they maintained a connection with their grandfather that had nearly been severed. "Dad," he said during one such visit, watching his daughter show me her science project, "I keep thinking about how close we came to losing this. To my children growing up never knowing you because of lies." "But they didn't lose me," I replied, squeezing his shoulder. "We found our way back to the truth. That's what matters now." 1 year after Margaret's death, we held a private memorial service, very different from the tension-filled funeral that had occurred amidst the family division. This gathering celebrated the real Margaret, the woman who had been loving, creative, and kind throughout most of her life, not the confused and manipulated person of her final years. Each family member shared a positive memory. Jason recalled how Margaret had stayed up all night helping him complete a school project he had procrastinated on. Thomas spoke of her attending every single one of his basketball games, keeping detailed statistics that she would review with him afterward. I shared the story of our first date. When Margaret had been so nervous, she spilled coffee all over both of us, then turned it into a joke that had us laughing until we cried. The healing wasn't perfect or complete. There remained awkward moments, painful memories, and the occasional resurgence of old hurts. But we were moving forward together, reclaiming the family bonds that had nearly been destroyed. Through this ordeal, I learned profound lessons about human vulnerability and resilience. I learned that even the strongest family bonds can be manipulated and broken through persistent lies. I learned that people we trust implicitly can sometimes betray that trust in the most devastating ways. But I also learned that truth has a persistence that eventually overcomes deception. I came to understand the vital importance of documenting concerns when something feels wrong. Had I pursued those questions about the unusual bank statements more vigorously, perhaps Margaret could have been protected. This knowledge became central to the educational programs our foundation developed. Most importantly, I learned about forgiveness, not as a single act but as an ongoing process. I had to forgive Margaret for believing Paula's lies. I had to forgive my sons for turning against me. And hardest of all, I had to forgive myself for not recognizing what was happening until it was too late to save Margaret from exploitation. The betrayal I experienced taught me who I truly am. When faced with the rejection of those I loved most, I didn't become bitter or vindictive. Instead, I remained steadfast in my commitment to truth and family. That knowledge gave me a strength and peace I hadn't expected to find in the aftermath of such pain. Today, as I watch my family slowly heal and reconnect, I feel profound gratitude for second chances. The folder that changed everything that day at the will reading didn't just expose a deception, it opened a path back to relationships I had feared were lost forever. If you've experienced family betrayal or estrangement, know that healing is possible, even when it seems hopeless. The truth has power, and love can survive even the most deliberate attempts to destroy it. Have you ever discovered a truth that changed everything in your family? Share your experience in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to hear more stories of family, truth, and reconciliation. Thank you for listening to my journey, and may your own path lead you to healing and peace.